Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I imagine the Wednesday before spring break is not necessarily the top thing on your list to be sitting here and listening. So I appreciate you being here, and I hope to try to keep your attention a bit. I do want to talk about global green supply chains, mostly as they relate to product systems. I mean, that's where a lot of the impact happens, and so that's where I want to go with this. To begin, before we sort of dig in deep to supply chains themselves, though, I think it's sort of important to just begin with the issue of what is green. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to be trying to address throughout this process. And so, I mean, if we look at the paper versus plastic debate of what is green and what is less green or more green, we can make arguments for why paper is better than plastic, mostly from a fossil resource or end-of-life perspective. We can discuss how plastic might be better than paper, mostly from an energy inputs and you know, but certainly plastic has some issues with regard to end-of-life kinds of issues. Even when we start looking at the sort of best of both worlds, you know, a lot of times the reusable bags might come from imported cotton, lots of inputs, and there would certainly be sort of a number of uses that would have to come into play before you sort of pay off the debt that you incur for making a much more impactful product to begin with. And with, you know, me, for example, I tend to forget these in the back of my car, you know, so how many times they actually get used can be a big deal. You know, we can certainly also look at much more complex products, of which is green. Is it a fuel economy, or is it a material intensity sort of a question? We can also make tons of issues. You know, we can also try to wade through the issues within the food labeling environment, right? So we've got lots of different definitions of what is green. And I guess rather than trying to debate what is the most green of these products, I think what's important to recognize is that behind each of these products, behind the attributes that are designed into the products that will make are basically a bunch of companies that make decisions about the capital infrastructure that are required to produce these products, the processes associated with material inputs and energy inputs and water inputs and chemical inputs that would effectively identify what the shade of green is of each of these products. And a lot of what I'm going to try to talk about today is how those decisions might happen and where there might be opportunities to influence those decisions throughout supply chains. So it starts with this sort of decision piece. And I like to try to frame this more as sort of a whole enterprise systems kind of approach in the context that we aren't just talking about supply chain management. We're really talking about supply chain management and a lot of environmental sciences and engineering that have to go into how you might make this work. But at the organizational level, we got managers and stakeholders that usually are making decisions at this organizational level. You know, and they're thinking about how marketing might influence the decision and how logistics might influence the decision and how operations and inventory management might all be part of this process of what do I do, what do I make, right? We certainly have the value chain associated with this as well. I mean, we've got suppliers that are also going to influence what kinds of inputs I can use. I've got customers that may influence how the product's used and what environments, what circumstances they might be used. And then we've got all sorts of inputs and outputs, right? We've got products that come out of these systems that hopefully have some degree of value attached to them. We've got emissions and wastes. We've also got issues associated with sort of human well-being, you know, quality of life and what things we might want to be looking at from those perspectives. So the idea here is that we really are looking at this context of a supply chain in terms of how we maximize the value of the stuff that comes out of that system. And we're looking at this idea of sustainability sciences as a very loose term associated with how we extend that measure of value to things that might include environmental and social performance. Right? So, but all across the way, as we're making these products, these goods and services and the impacts associated with them, we're finding those impacts and we're finding that value in across the boundaries of ownership. Right? One organization doesn't necessarily own the value that's inputted or created or added to the offering, nor do they own all of the impacts associated with the inputs or outputs associated with them. So that's sort of the context that we're looking at the system. And just as a little quick aside, almost more than anything, I think it's important to sort of figure out, look a little bit into the historical perspective of supply chain management and sustainability, because it really is sort of a natural fit. They were both born at about the same time, the early to mid 80s, in terms of when these concepts were really sort of becoming part of the sort of lexicon of at least in the management realm. There's no one definition. There was a paper in 2009 from Stock and Boyer that came up with 173 different definitions of supply chain management. When we think about sustainability, there's an increasing call for managers, society as a whole, to sort of accept this sort of plurality of views towards sustainability, so that we don't necessarily have to get so much concern about what exactly we're measuring, as long as we can sort of get ourselves pointed in the right direction. And when we think about themes across these two, we have significant themes around integration, coordination, interaction and relationships, issues about where we have to balance between stakeholders and members of the supply chain, and certainly issues of how we might distribute either responsibility or value across those, right? So we've got these issues of how we might measure and monitor the distribution of stuff, right? So in supply chain management, we talk about sort of moving of materials, and when we oftentimes are thinking about sustainability, at least from the sort of industrial ecology sort of framework, we'll think about energy and material flows quite a bit, okay? But overall, for the last decade, both groups have been trying to figure out who does it in the organization, right? So who has the authority, who has the responsibility for those functions within an organization? And that's been an ongoing dialogue in both the supply chain management world and the sustainability world. And also, what are the benchmarks and measures for each of these systems? In both cases, I think you can make an argument that they mean everything and nothing at all, right? So you have supply chain management, which is really a collection of traditional functions within a firm. There already is procurement and pricing and distribution and finance and all the others, right? And a supply chain manager's goal is to maximize the value for the end-use customer. And sustainability managers are told that we're supposed to measure and manage towards everything, environmental, social, economic benefits and costs. In both cases, there's very little budget to do either, and trying to struggle to see where they fit in this sort of holistic picture versus the individual functional roles. So the idea that these two forces are sort of joining and are finding a fit and finding sort of traction in their organizations probably isn't that surprising. The concepts, as being holistic concepts, are quite similar. So why do we care? Why do we do this stuff? Why are we thinking about this in a supply chain realm? Or why are we thinking about it as something broader than just my organization, as a company or a firm or a producer of some kind? And a lot of this is coming down on a relatively new focus, although I wouldn't say it's entirely new. But there's certainly been more emphasis on it lately, around materiality. And so what matters? And if you go to the GRI sort of definition of what matters, GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative. They're one of the sort of key players in terms of how companies might talk about what they do and how they address issues of sustainability. They'll typically talk about it in terms of impacts along the x-axis and the importance in terms of stakeholders, in terms of sort of an external sort of perspective on what should be focused on. So you've got sort of these impacts, and along the bottom, along the x-axis, which often is interpreted from companies' perspective as the impacts on the company, even though I think it's much broader than that. And then you have issues of stakeholders on the top. And what is material, I think oftentimes falls into a couple different buckets. And I think you can think about it pretty broadly in terms of risks and opportunities. And risks being mostly around issues of sort of operational risks and reputational risks, and opportunities typically being efficiency types of gains. Okay, so ways I can get more for less. And those happen disproportionately inside and outside of your actual ownership of the processes you might be looking at. Okay, so this is what we're going to try to focus on. I'm going to first talk about some of the issues of impacts, and then we'll get to the stakeholder piece as well. So I mean, if we start thinking about issues of risks, I mean, there definitely are increasing risks that we're beginning to see in terms of climate-related losses and supply disruption. So if you just look at the natural catastrophes as reported by Swiss Re through 2011, in this case, we're seeing a definite trend of increased costs associated with natural catastrophes. And we're also seeing a significant amount of exposed loss, right? Losses that aren't insured. So losses that will have to be borne out by either the companies themselves, society itself, or oftentimes governments to bail them out. What we also are seeing is that many large multinationals are beginning to see this in their own organizations in terms of supply disruptions. So when there is a major flooding event, you can't get your trucks to where you want them to go. When you have a major drought that causes fires, which causes significant stress on the global wheat supply, then you have political interventions and you have significant price increases associated with your access to supply. So in any case, we're seeing large numbers of companies beginning to say, you know, these are risks and risks that have to be managed. And that management is either through sort of business interruption insurance or through supply chain structure and design decisions. But there's an issue of how we might begin to address these issues of risk. This one here, it was actually part of the tsunami stuff in Japan. I think that's where that came from. We can also think about risk in terms of resource availability. And we hear a lot about issues around rare earth minerals. We hear a lot of issues, and we have for many, many years, around fossil fuels, around water. There was a great talk from Raj Rajan in this series just a few weeks ago talking about issues of water and availability. But I wanted to actually just bring up illustrate an example that's maybe a little more mundane but a lot closer to my heart, which is coffee. And this plays out in many different environments. But the idea is regardless, if you're looking at Ethiopia or Nicaragua or Mexico, major producing regions of coffee are changing dramatically due to climate change. So the best coffee in the world can only be grown at certain latitudes, and the climates are changing within those latitudes, and the way in which we're using the soils available at those latitudes are changing dramatically. And so if we look across the next 20, 30, 40 years, we're seeing some pretty dramatic shifts in terms of where and how coffee might be sourced and what might happen to the price of coffee. Some models showing 90+% reductions in terms of the available area for coffee production at sort of that acidity range that we all like the taste. So these are things that happen, and they happen across different kinds of crops, different kinds of materials, and this is an issue that many firms, especially in the agricultural environment, are dealing with on a regular basis. It's almost impossible to avoid the reputational risk argument. So whether you're talking about peanut butter and what peanut butter might go into, whether you're talking about social issues in terms of factory safety, or whether you're looking at horse meat interjecting into supply chains, a lot of the reputational risks associated with supply chain, either on an environmental or social dimension, is largely due to the ability or inability to be able to see into your supply chain and the transparency into your supply chain. So again, as we start thinking about the issues of how might you be able to influence your supply chain, knowing what you're dealing with becomes an issue in many of these situations. Right? So you certainly don't want to be identified as, as IKEA's Swedish meatballs having horse meat in them, for example. Right? A lot of money to come through that. When we think about opportunity, a lot of these fall into the efficiency realm. So again, as we start looking at where impacts reside, we can also begin to figure out where there might be opportunities for improved efficiencies. And so whether you're looking at energy or water or material efficiencies, The idea being that you may not necessarily have control over the largest lever within your organization to be able to find those efficiencies or influence those efficiencies is most often the case. Whether it's trying to find carbon efficiencies associated with agriculturally based products, everything from meats to your box of Wheaties cereal, or whether you're looking at computer components of where might you be able to reduce the total energy inputs in terms of the components going into those. Those tend to be upstream in fertilizers or in silicone processing, and less so with regard to your own branded product, per se, closer to the customer end of the supply chain. And if you look at sort of consumptive impacts of the whole US economy, about 70% of those impacts are tied up in these messy supply chains. Right? Very few of the impacts associated with what we do and what we buy or what we might have closer to consumption. Most of those impacts then happen through some kind of some intermediate processor. Very few of them flow directly, right? So, I mean, we do have some that have less processing. We burn fuel, we burn coal, we burn other things that could certainly be part of that, but most require some additional processes. So if we move to the other axis, we start thinking about these issues of stakeholders. The stakeholder element is really what sort of helps provide some meaning to organizations, right, in terms of where there might be importance to act. Right? Some of those stakeholders are more important than others. Shareholders tend to be pretty important stakeholders. Right? Most large companies the managers are there simply to spend other people's money. Right? And so if I have some legal obligations for how I can spend your money and how I can't spend your money, but there are also many other stakeholders. There are employees, there are investors, there are civil actors in civil society, nonprofits, and others. I started putting up logos, and then I started thinking, God, that's silly, because there's a gazillion logos, and I've forgotten a gazillion of them off of this list. I started mostly with ones that are more business-friendly, to be perfectly honest. So we have the GRI stuff. We've got CDP work in here. A lot of lists are created about who's the best and who's the worst in different ways. This is part of the Newsweek one. The greenhouse, the GHG protocol is WRI and World Business Council for Sustainable Development activity. Ceres has been very involved in trying to get carbon and water disclosures into reporting regulations. The Sustainability Consortium is a university-led effort between ASU and Arkansas, trying to get at some of the accounting issues and some of the measurement issues. Corporate Eco Forum, GEMI, EDF, the list goes on. TSC's got stuff in supply chain. WWF has stuff in supply chain. I mean, there's not a lack of activity going on in terms of trying to identify where are these big levers that we can pull and who can influence what those levers might be. I've highlighted a few just because they're very direct ways in which supply chains are being implicated, I guess, in terms of the way in which stakeholders are thinking about them. And so the new G4 version of the GRI rules, which basically are rules for how you disclose information as a company, are now requiring procurement procurement processes and other things to be involved within that. CDP is increasing its focus on Scope 3 emissions, and I'll talk about those in a little bit, but basically Scope 3s are your indirect kinds of emissions, less your energy inputs. I'll talk about that in just a second. But these things matter, right? So these things elevate in that little matrix, elevate things that might be of high impact, though maybe not so important to the impact of the firm, to the firm's performance or the firm's survival, but elevating up into that right-hand corner of places where measuring and identifying and communicating what those impacts look like become of increasing importance. So I want to put a little plug into what we do at NorthStar. And part of it is trying to interact with and engage with these stakeholder groups, businesses included. in terms of how private sector impacts occur and where they might occur within these supply chains. Okay? So we call this, we've been talking about it for a long time, but we've been sort of settled on this idea of change-inspired scholarship. I'm not sure how much that really makes sense. But the idea here is that we're trying to identify where opportunities exist, but opportunities exist where there's a specific outcome that's desired. Okay, and an outcome where both scientists and practitioners are at least in a vision sort of like this, are able to be pointed in the same direction, right? The issue is that these systems are very different. The practice system and the scholarship system really are quite different. And I think it's very hard to say that all joining hands and walking together in collective or collaborative research solves the problem, because I think you end up oftentimes with pretty poor quality research, which is not relevant to anybody. And so what a lot of what we're trying to do within the NorthStar environment is to basically provoke and irritate and inspire each other long enough that we each ask a little bit better questions. Okay, so it's not like we're creating large-scale collaborative research that has some big joint report at the end of the day, but we are trying to get people together enough times and have enough continuity through these sorts of liaison roles, which are often focused on trying to characterize the system that each of us play in, long enough that we can begin to have access into different organizations' change designs, right? Some new thing that a company's trying to start or an NGO's trying to start. And by doing that, we've been able to gain access to data. We've been able to gain access to sort of prototypes or demonstrations of these, and then therefore being able to create some research that hopefully can influence change, right? So that's what we're attempting to do with this. And we've done this with a number of different projects. And I just want to walk through a couple of them, because these are these supply chain initiatives that we have oftentimes a little bit better insight into, because we've been able to create these relationships with them. So if we think about this idea of supply chain management or supply chain energy and carbon management, we get people together who are great at facilitating and convening. Those have created, we've created some system awareness documents. We basically write papers, right? So we've written a few papers about what these systems look like. And then we've engaged with a couple different activities in terms of where these organizations are now attempting to make change, right? So we got some funding from ClimateWorks Foundation in cooperation with CDP. CDP used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. They've dropped that because they're now focusing on other things besides carbon. They also still focus on carbon. And the Institute for Industrial Productivity. And so there's a project where they're doing a small-scale pilot project, trying to get some large companies to try to influence their supply chains. We'll talk about that in just a second. And we've also pulled in some funding, actually through the help of IRE and IonE, where we've been focused on more of the energy system. So, but what we did is we got people together. We got them to ask this question of, how can we help our suppliers manage their energy better? And how can we do that as a we being sort of large buyers at the end of a supply chain? Right? So large multinational branded companies. How can they begin to do this? Is it a financing problem? Maybe. We talked about that for a long time. This paper focuses on that pretty much directly. Is it an issue of influence and pressure? Is it an issue of trying to understand supply chains as institutions? These are all things that became part of that conversation, and they spun out into different activities. But being part of that process from the beginning, we have some access into some data and some resources that have been kind of fun to play with. One of the things we did is we got them together. I know you can't read a lot of this. I apologize. Slides are not my strong suit. But we got a bunch of people together, and we asked some of those questions. And one of the things that we really were trying to get at is this issue is, are supply chains institutions in and of themselves? I mean, can they be a mechanism for addressing or managing collective action problems, right? And a collective action problem in the sense that there are sort of common goods that are available. The energy system, in a particular way, is subsidized in many, many ways that provides a more common good sort of environment. We've got significant transaction costs that get in the way. The costs associated with the savings of energy efficiency programs tend to not elevate high enough for any one company to make any change. And the question then became, is there a possibility to be able to address these kinds of inaction, this well-documented energy efficiency gap? Does there become a way where we can address that in a collective environment? One where the transaction costs might be able to be shared across the system, and where free riding might actually be accepted, right? The idea that your manufacturer in China might be allowed to free ride as long as the system is able to become more efficient, and eventually there's a benefit to that could be realized downstream. So these are all things that have been documented in the different literatures. But the question was, is this possible? And if so, how might we study it? How might we be able to contribute to this conversation? And then we came up with a number of recommendations. This is a little graphic about the energy system itself. I mean, basically, you've got markets up here that are structured in a way that the market participants might like a certain kind of carbon associated or carbon intensive energy product, and the energy market people like a certain amount of aggregation of demand. And so these things are what create the monetary aspect of electricity or of energy of any kind, really. And the idea here is that energy is used all throughout different parts of the supply chain, right? So we're still working out a lot of the spatial issues and how we connect to this. This is one of the projects that I'm not going to talk about too much around, where we're looking at the upper Midwest system in this, actually the mid-continent system in this. But the idea being that we might have a large leading company on one end that's interested in both the carbon profile and the energy costs associated with energy use across different sectors, that would require a connecting of the dots between all the baselining work and individual engineering assessments that get done at each individual firm, and stitch it together in a way that the overall system performs better, is more cost effective, is lower carbon intensive, right? And so one thing that came out of this is that we need to do a couple things. We need to do a lot of things that were sort of difficult to even write down actually with a straight face. But we did come up with a few things. Well, first we need to engage a few large leading companies who'd be willing to even give this a shot, right? So that was one thing we needed to try to do. And the other thing we needed to do is we need to expand some of this sector level benchmarking to be able to talk to the supply chain level, right? So each one sector is only one sector that might have some contribution into another sector's performance, right? So these two things are things that we actually have been able to move forward with through some of these kinds of change design activities, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of them, which is the CDP Action Exchange. So this is that project through ClimateWorks with CDP and IIP. And basically what we've got is a little trial. We've got 6 large companies, Walmart and Vodafone and Philips, and I can't remember the rest. But Pepsi is one of them. So we got 6 companies. Each of them have asked their supply chains. Those that are participating in the supply chain reporting activities of CDP, which is about 3,000. Jennifer, am I right? I'm looking at Jennifer because she's the one who you should talk to for sure on this project. But about 3,000 companies over the last 3 or 4 years have been filling out this survey of what my carbon profile looks like, and they're doing it because their customers are asking them to do that. Okay? So we go to these 6 companies. These 6 companies ask their suppliers to not only report, but also to improve, which is something we haven't seen as well with these supply chain-oriented responders to the CDP reporting activity, as we have as when investors ask you to report. There's been a bit more improvement among those who are reporting their performance when investors ask. I think there's sort of an issue of maybe those responding because their customers asked them don't think their customers care that much, right? So the idea with this project is that they're actually being called out as key suppliers. They're actually being called out by a company In this case, it's saying, we actually care a little bit. It's hard to know exactly how much they're saying that they care, but they certainly are looking for improvement, not just reporting. Right? So what we've done as part of this is we've created some of these supplier profiles, which basically for each one of those suppliers gives them a bit of a snapshot, some benchmarking, based on how other people have reported these results over the past 3 years, and how their performance stacks up kind of against similar companies and similar industries and similar regions. I think we actually dropped the region one, but that's a technicality. So in any case, they're given this information, and CDP is trying to facilitate some of that connection with service providers. So service providers being a Siemens or a Johnson Controls or a Honeywell or something like that, they would come in and implement carbon reducing programs, right? So energy efficiency programs, those kinds of things. So in order to try to do that, we have to begin to start to figure out and classify what these groups look like, right? And what the kinds of emissions look like. And so this is my daughter this morning said she thought it was a spider. It might be. But basically we have this firm in the middle, and when you're thinking about carbon management, scope 1 are sort of your direct combustion, your direct emissions from within your walls of your organization. We think about scope 2 as being your purchased emissions, mostly from utilities, right? So it's typically your electricity and your purchased steam is what's typically within this boat. So this then becomes sort of your scope 1 and scope 2s, right? What's closest to you as an organization. Everything else is a scope 3 emission, right? So any other emissions in the GHG protocol, the WRI and World Business Council approach to managing carbon and the methodologies associated with reporting that carbon, everything else is a scope 3. But those scope 3s can happen across different levels of your supply chain, right? So you can have tier 1 suppliers who are basically your direct suppliers. I pay you some money, you give me some stuff. But I can also have tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, where they're my supplier's suppliers, right? And we can do some techniques where we can begin to look at what this sort of overall system's emissions impacts might look like by looking out at these different components and allocating them back to a particular unit of economic activity that happens here within the focal sector, right? So we can do this looking at economy-wide values. We can also do it trying to do very costly and very robust accounting through your supply chain. Okay, but this is sort of the world that we're trying to look at. And I wanted to present a case study of one of these companies that we're looking at in this study. I'm not sure whether we're able to disclose names or not yet, so I'm trying not to at this point. But we basically have a target firm, which is a very large diversified tech company. And if we look across their company's inputs and outputs, right? So if we create a hybrid input-output model, and again, lots of caveats. We're basing this all on a US context, even though they have global operations. But if we were to begin to sort of weight what those inputs would look like across different kinds of inputs into what they produce, right? Because they produce a whole bunch of different stuff. We can begin to look at the scope 1 emissions as really being roughly about 5% of their total emissions. We can look at their scope 2 emissions as being about 13% of their total emissions, but 82% are everything else. And we see this often in lots of different sectors, and a lot of you are shaking your head. I'm like, yes, I know this already. But it's true. I mean, so this happens quite often, and a lot of it is because we have so many inputs that become inputs that become inputs that become inputs before I buy them, right? And each of those processing steps have different energy and material activities associated with them. So what we were trying to do with this then is we wanted to look at, so all this really does here by providing these weights is creates a baseline. It creates sort of a weighted input-output baseline that looks an awful lot like this company's, right? And so what we're trying to look at then is by doing that then, and we did this analysis so you can look at the sort of these direct purchases, these direct tier 1 purchases, and we're able to account for about 94% of all their purchases, all of the inputs associated with those. and we're able to include about 99% of this total CO2 of the system. So we're at least looking at most of the system at this point. The issue is, though, is once you start trying to figure out what do I have direct control over, I start to lose a lot. Right? There's so much that starts to be sort of beyond my visibility as that central company. And so as I start to do that, I can start looking at just the top 44, just where these two top 100 lists overlap. And while just focusing on those 44 inputting sectors, so we're doing this at sort of a sector level, but you can think of them as sort of material inputs that come into the system. They can be service inputs as well. Just looking at 44, I still get about 71% of that total impact, right? But if I look at just the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of my direct purchases, right? So is everyone sort of visualizing that? So I'm just looking at this being a direct purchase, and I'm including this little yellow node, which is my utility purchase inside of that, right? So things that I could go to my direct supplier and say, you know, here's some things that I think you could maybe think about. You know, I mean, I would like to know how you manage your energy, right? You can influence some of your Scope 2 through efficiency gains, through retrofits, through investments in your organization. We can also think about sort of how are you structuring the processes that might make that input for me, right? Do you buy a certain amount of organic inputs? I mean, do you have farmers that are supplying into your product that would be growing their crops on precision farmed lands? You know, how are you doing it? I'm trying to just address the problem. I'm trying to learn about what you're doing because I'm trying to figure out how to manage my carbon. Right? So if I do those, though, I start to only account for about 34% of the total system's impacts. Right? Just focused on my direct suppliers and the way those direct suppliers either purchase energy inputs or manage their own operations. Okay? So I sort of fall off a little bit in terms of what I can influence. But if I then start to figure out how can I then weight the different suppliers that I have in terms of their importance to being able to manage at least what I can see, this 34%. Not every supplier is equal. Right? I wouldn't just go and say, here's all my suppliers, go tell me what your carbon emissions are, and I want to now figure out where your improvements are, and your improvements are sort of my improvements, so I can report them now. Right? That's all well and good, but the fact is that some suppliers are much more important from a carbon perspective. And a lot of times those suppliers who are important from a carbon perspective are not the ones I spend the most money with. Because I know the ones I spend the most money with really well. But oftentimes they're not necessarily the highest carbon inputting sectors. Okay? So things like this materials for this particular organization is primarily driven by glass. Issues of commodity chemicals become important. Issues of trucking and steel become somewhat important. But when I look at who did they ask to supply information to CDP, only about half of them are in their sort of target sectors. Right? Half of the companies that they're trying to manage or trying to get as part of these sort of reporting activities to try to influence their activities are ones that really don't matter very much. Right? So again, trying to be able to identify where in your supply chain to exert influence becomes important. What we did find, to their credit, though, of at least this company, is that they are associated with a higher performing supply chain. And we don't really understand why yet. This is not necessarily a causal environment where, yes, this company went out and they demanded it and they sought out a supply chain that was less carbon intensive. But in terms of the metrics that CDP develops in terms of how well you're managing your carbon, how well you're reporting your carbon, the supplying firms associated, weighted again, with this company report a significantly higher score than everybody else within that same weighted activity, okay, in that same sort of hybridized, fake industry environment, right? But it's our control group, and that's, I think, something worth. I don't know if it's worth repeating as much as it's worth recognizing that I think there is a way that good companies like to associate with good companies, and good companies can through their assembly of their supply chains associate with better companies. And I think we're seeing some evidence of that, which we don't see very often. So anyway, that's one example. Another thing we can think about is there are some sectors that we know are high impactful sectors, right? We know that corn is a high impact input to lots of different goods and services. And so we're working with EDF right now. If we look at just at Walmart, EDF and Walmart have a very strong relationship. EDF's actually created offices that are co-located with Walmart so that they can work more closely together in terms of trying to solve some of these problems. But Walmart estimates that about 45% of its total supply chain impacts, and I don't know exactly how they did this, but I would assume it's pretty similar to our assessment of these Scope 3 emissions, that 45% of its supply chain's emissions come from just the application of nitrogen fertilizer on corn. Okay, so this is a big place for them to try to focus and try to figure out where they might be able to influence the system. So again, if we start with the idea of a large user of corn, poultry uses about 13% of the U.S. corn crop, and we look at sort of how poultry processing translates, so parts of chickens translate into whole chickens, and how whole chickens might purchase food in terms of direct grains or processed food, and then begin to map that out to the different places where corn is grown and how much inputs might be associated with those. And a lot of this work is being done here in GLI. Some of the best stuff in that area is being done here. We can begin to start to look at, well, I want to highlight over here. We can start to look at some of these sectors as being really highly concentrated, right? The top 3 poultry processing companies own about 50% of all the processed chicken in the US, right? So if I'm Walmart and I'm wanting to address 45% of my impacts, which is associated with corn, and 13% of that is in processing, and only 3 of them really matter or are most important to that, we can begin to look at something and say like Pilgrim's Pride, one of the largest poultry manufacturer in the US, processor in the US, might actually have influence over more than 2% of all the corn grown in the US, right? So we might then start to figure out, well, where does that matter, right? So we've done a lot of stuff like this. It's where corn's produced, how much fertilizers are applied, but we very rarely have started to look at where are the manufacturing and processing facilities associated with these large manufacturers or processors of chicken, because these are pulling from corn from different parts of the country where the improvement factors associated with different ways of applying fertilizer might translate into very different kinds of outputs in terms of the reductions associated with carbon emissions. So in any case, this is very early on. We haven't done much with it yet, but this is where we're going. These were going to be very nicely done GIS maps, but it didn't work out today. So that's a total fudge right there, just in all perfect disclosure. Another project that we're focused on is one very similar process, right? We get people together who know how to talk really well. We do some initial systems-based kind of assessments, and now we start to work with a couple different organizations, these 2 being consortia of large companies, where they then are trying to figure out how can we measure and manage these sort of supply chain-oriented impacts. We also have a project with USDA looking at some stuff very similar as well. The goal here is to try to take some of that activity, some of those, whether we're talking about corn and inputs into poultry or beef or beverages, sugary beverages, trying to take those kinds of impacts and be able to bring them down to a procurement manager's level, right? Because when we started this conversation, it was about what is green. And we think about individual purchases. I buy some coffee and I want to buy green coffee. I want to buy that chair for my office and I want to buy a green chair, right? And I can go and I can study all sorts of stuff. I take a group of students to Costa Rica every January, and I still don't know how to assess the labels on the shelves in coffee, on the coffee shelf in the grocery store. These are complicated and difficult tasks at the individual product level. Procurement managers buy thousands of products every week, every month, every year, right? If you think about the cafeterias at the University of Minnesota, they buy a ton of stuff. And so a lot of what we're trying to do with this is to try to bring that kind of visibility of individual product in individual sectors into a tool that would allow you to compare both within those sectors of what kinds of things could I change. Is organic what I should be looking at, or is it energy inputs in my manufacturing phase, or should it be the package design? What is it that's important to that product? So where are there places where I can pull levers within a sector? But then how can I compare between sectors, right? Because I want to make sure that I'm focused on, if I'm going to look at my cereal products, I want to try to compare a change I make in the way I purchase cereals for my cafeteria. And I want to compare it against the soaps that I use to wash the dishes at the end of the day. Right? Because I want to figure out where is it that I can pull the lever, and where can that lever help my organization best reduce its carbon or water impacts. And that's what we're focused on in this project early on, right? Now again, it's a pilot project. We're mostly trying to get the tool built. We're working with a group called Climate Earth, who's a business intelligence consulting company. They do a lot of this platform development work. We're doing basically efforts to create, we're wanting to guide those priorities. Don't focus on printer ink cartridges if that's not what's important to managing your carbon footprint. Don't focus on paper towel dispensers in your bathroom if that's not what's important to managing your carbon footprint. So we're trying to figure out how to prioritize across this portfolio of products, and we're also trying to figure out how to measure the performance of different sourcing strategies. So those are the key things we're working on. We're trying to focus it on identifying those hotspots or those within a CO2 and water environment. We're trying to quantify what happens in terms of different scenarios associated with reducing those hotspots. And then we want to try to, we actually just met with a colleague at Michigan last week, trying to figure out if we can build some optimization algorithms into this that says if I want to set a target, a carbon reduction target, given certain prices of what I'm paying for these inputs, what is my optimal mix of shifts in the way I spend my money? If I want to increase, if I'm willing to increase my budget by 10% to try to buy more green stuff, where do I allocate that 10% of increased budget? Right? So these are the three things we're trying to do. We're trying to identify priorities, we're trying to quantify reductions in those priority areas, and we're trying to figure out how to spend your money differently between those. You know, and it's not really an on or off switch, right? These systems are actually quite flexible in terms of what they can do, because I'm not talking about just buying only organic cereal, or I'm going to buy only chicken-based pork, or not chicken-based pork, chicken-based sausages, right? I'm not looking at just all or nothing. It might be that I'm looking at my cereal bins in the cafeteria, and I just switch from a 60-40 split of corn to wheat-based cereals and flip-flop them, right? Or I might be able to just make it 40-40, and the other 20% start to really focus on that 20% of how can I get a precision agricultured wheat product, right? How can I figure out if my cereal producers can't begin to figure out some way of telling me how they source their wheat with regard to that cereal. So those are ways we can do it. This is basically doing that activity. These are these scenarios. Riley Olson, I don't know if she's in here today, in our group has been doing a lot of this work where she's looking at different scenarios of what happens when you begin to change and pull those different levers. The issue here is that the hotspots are only a signal of where to look, but they don't really address issues of potential impact reduction. Right? There are different technological constraints. There's only so much gain I can get from organic, or so much gain I can get from precision agriculture. Only so much gain I can get in terms of the scenario's impacts by some process changes, right? So by switching energy sources in my plant, or by changing the way I apply fertilizer, right? There's some theoretical sort of technological gaps, or not gaps, but limits. There are budget limits. And there's reduction target limits that I might be willing to address. All of these begin to change what works best, right? Corn might be a really high impactful input for Walmart, but it may not be the highest impact input given what you can do to fix it, right? So we have to begin to figure out how we work through those things. So, to wrap up, basically, I think it's important to start thinking about this idea of managing risks and efficiency opportunities. Maybe rather than thinking about it in terms of responsibility. Responsibility is really messy, and it's shared, and it's blurry. And it's really hard to say, you are responsible because you created that input, and you're not responsible even though you want to buy it. Right? So this whole concept of responsibility and how we place an onus on individuals of where you should make changes, I think are very difficult. I think if we start talking about it in terms of where there's risk, and risk to different stakeholders, risk to different parts of the impacting or the impacted systems, or if we think about where we can fix things, I think it's a more, at least from a corporate perspective, it's an easier road to go down. I also think choosing green is too complicated to be left to the purchaser. That goes for us as individuals, and it also goes to professional purchasers. We have been refocusing a lot of our work through these conversations with these stakeholder groups that these are really strategic decisions. It's a strategic sourcing decision that happens a couple times a year at best, right? The actual purchaser sitting behind the console trying to figure out how to buy the 50 things that they're going to buy that day. These things are still too complicated to be able to integrate into that system. So I think you need some censoring mechanism. We need companies, we need Walmart and Macy's and Target to censor what we get access to, just like they censor for quality. And I know we like to think that we have total control of what we should and shouldn't be able to buy, but we do that all the time. I go to Macy's because they got products I want to buy at Macy's, and that's why I didn't go to JCPenney's, right? They have different stuff. And these companies and your sort of sourcing strategy groups provide that sort of filter. And I think that's where the complexity of the issues can really be addressed and handled. Finally, I think as we start thinking about this idea of supply chains as an institution, meaning that they create and set rules, norms, processes for monitoring, sanctioning bad actors, that these might actually hold some promise in terms of how we might address these sorts of collective action problems where it's very hard to get individuals to act on a common good. So with that, I'm done, and I'm sorry I took so long.